3 months after the first successful defense against the Devourer fleet, the Council forces had transformed completely. Ships that once competed for forward positions now carefully maintained defensive spacing. Warriors who once rushed toward threats now paused to gather information first. The change was not easy for species raised on warrior traditions, but necessity proved a powerful teacher. Jake Morrison spent those months training Council officers in human tactical philosophy. He taught them about defensive depth, about knowing when to retreat, about the value of survival over glory. Most importantly, he taught about adaptation and being willing to question assumptions. One evening, Jake sat in the observation deck reviewing tactical data when Vekthar found him. The Krenth commander sat down nearby, looking surprisingly comfortable in the quiet space. "I have been thinking about what you said, about how humans survived on Earth," Vekthar began. "About how the bravest warriors died while the cautious ones survived. It troubles me because it suggests that courage is a weakness, and I cannot accept that." Jake set down his tablet and looked at the Krenth directly. "Courage is not a weakness, Commander. But courage without wisdom is just recklessness. The bravest human warriors in our history were not the ones who charged blindly into battle. They were the ones who faced terrifying odds while using every advantage they could find to survive. Real courage is not ignoring fear. It is functioning despite fear." "The Krenth do not feel fear," Vekthar said automatically, then paused. "Or perhaps we do, and we have simply built our entire culture around denying it. Every species feels fear, Commander. It is a survival mechanism," Lisa Grant said, appearing from another entrance. "Humans learn to use fear as a tool. It makes us cautious when we should be cautious, creative when we need solutions, and determined when determination is what matters." Vekthar was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with concepts that challenged his entire worldview. Finally, he spoke again. "Will you teach me? Not just tactics, but the philosophy behind them. I want to understand how humans think about warfare." Over the following weeks, Jake worked closely with Vekthar and other Council commanders who genuinely wanted to understand, rather than just mimic human tactics. They learned about asymmetric warfare, about turning disadvantages into advantages, about thinking multiple moves ahead. The war continued, but its character had changed dramatically. The Devourers were no longer facing dozens of proud warrior species fighting, according to predictable patterns. They were facing an enemy that had learned to adapt, to think strategically, and to value survival over glory. 6 months after the failed Devourer offensive, intelligence reports suggested that the enemy had consolidated their remaining forces at a stronghold deep in the Caldris system. Long-range scans indicated massive fortifications, hundreds of ships, and defensive networks that would make a direct assault catastrophically expensive. In the strategic chamber aboard the GSC Unity, Council military leaders debated their options. Some argued for a massive assault while others suggested a siege. Colonel Danny Price listened from his position in the back, his expression thoughtful. Finally, Fleet Admiral Gendra addressed Danny directly. "Colonel Price, your forces have guided us this far. What would humans recommend?" Danny stood and moved to the central display. "Before I answer that, Admiral, I need to ask a question. What is our actual objective here?" General Krath looked confused. "To destroy the Devourers, obviously. To eliminate the threat they pose to the galaxy. Why?" Danny asked simply. The question caught everyone off guard. High Priest Luminar responded first. "Because they attacked us. Because they destroyed systems and killed billions. Because they are a threat that must be neutralized." "All true," Danny acknowledged. "But think more specifically. The Devourers have been pushed back to a single fortified system. They have not launched any offensives in 3 months. They are contained. So I ask again, what is our objective?" Commander Srel understood immediately. "You are suggesting that our objective should be containment rather than destruction." "I am suggesting we consider our options carefully," Danny replied. "A direct assault on their stronghold would be incredibly costly. We would win eventually, but we would lose hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of lives. And for what? To destroy an enemy that is already effectively neutralized?" The debate that followed was intense. Some felt that leaving the Devourers alive was unacceptable, while others argued that Danny's approach made strategic sense. After hours of discussion, Fleet Admiral Gendra announced her decision. "We will implement a modified version of Colonel Price's plan. We establish a blockade around the Caldris system. strong enough to contain the Devourers but not so concentrated that we cannot respond to other threats. However, we also prepare for an eventual assault if needed. Over the next 2 months, the Council fleet established a comprehensive blockade. The Devourers tested it several times, but each time the Council forces responded exactly as trained, containing the threat without overcommitting. Then, nearly 8 months after the blockade began, something changed. The Devourers sent a communication. It was the first time in the entire war that the enemy had attempted any form of dialogue. The message consisted of a single question, repeated in every major Council language. "Why do you sit in the back?" Jake Morrison, reading the message in the strategic chamber, began to laugh. "They are asking about us. The Devourers have been watching the Council forces adapt and change tactics. They have figured out that humans are somehow connected to their defeats, but they cannot understand why we are always in the back." Danny Price smiled too. "They are trying to understand our tactics by asking about our positioning. How do we respond?" General Krath asked. "Honestly," Danny replied. He opened a communication channel and recorded a message. "To the Devourers in the Caldris system, we sit in the back because that is where we can see everything, where we have time to think, and where we survive long enough to win. We sit in the back because our ancestors learned over millions of years that survival beats glory. We sit in the back because it works." He sent the message and then added a second one offering terms. The Devourers could remain contained peacefully or face overwhelming force if they attempted to break out. 3 days later, the Devourers agreed to the containment. The war was effectively over. In the strategic chamber of the GSC Unity, the senior Council leadership gathered for a final assessment. Fleet Admiral Gendra spoke with unusual emotion in her voice. 6 months ago, we were losing this war. We would have continued losing if we had not learned to change. And we learned because 5 humans showed us a different way to think about warfare. These humans brought no superior weapons or technology. They brought perspective, patience, and thousands of years of survival wisdom. They taught us that victory is not about courage or strength, but about adaptation and strategy. General Krath stood next. "The humans also taught us that there is no shame in survival. My species has always believed that glory in death is the highest honor. But honor means nothing if everyone dies. The humans showed us that true courage is surviving long enough to protect those who depend on us." Danny Price stepped forward. "We appreciate the recognition, but understand this was not about humans being superior. This was about different experiences leading to different insights. The key is being willing to learn from each other." Fleet. Admiral Gendra announced that the Council had voted unanimously to establish a new joint, strategic command structure, with human advisors integrated into every major fleet element. Colonel Danny Price would serve as co-commander of all Council military forces. As the formal proceedings concluded, Vekthar approached the human team one final time. "Now that the war is over and your tactics have been proven, will you finally move to the front?" The Krenth commander asked. Jake, Lisa, Danny, Amy, Kyle, and Brandon exchanged looks. Then Jake answered for all of them. "No, Commander. We will stay in the back, not because we have to, but because that is where we belong. That is where we can see everything, where we can think clearly, and where we can do the most good." Vekthar nodded slowly. "I understand now. The galaxy's mightiest species finally learned why humans sit in the back. It is not weakness or fear. It is wisdom. And survival," Lisa added. "Never forget survival." In the years that followed, the story of the Devourer War became a foundational legend throughout Council space. The phrase "sitting in the back" became shorthand for strategic perspective and tactical patience. The humans remained in their advisory roles, training generation after generation of Council officers in the philosophy that had won the war. The Devourers remained contained in the Caldris system, and the blockade became permanent. Some speculated that the enemy had learned their own lessons from the war, discovering that the Council forces could no longer be defeated with predictable tactics. And through it all, in command centers throughout Council space, human advisors sat in the back. They sat where they could see everything, where they could think clearly, where they could survive. They sat where their ancestors had taught them to sit, in the position that offered the best chance of survival. They sat in the back, and the galaxy was safer for it. The Devourer fleet that emerged from faster-than-light travel was massive. At least 40 ships of varying sizes, all of them bearing the same organic, shifting appearance as the vessels the Council had fought before. They did not bother with communications or warnings. They simply began moving toward the Council fleet with clear hostile intent. Fleet Admiral Gendra looked at the tactical display, then at Colonel Danny Price. "Can you help us win this battle, human?" "I do not know," Danny replied honestly. "But I know we will lose if we fight the way you normally fight. Give me tactical command and I will give you the best chance of survival." The request was unprecedented. Humans were the newest species in the Council, with no combat reputation and no proven track record. Giving them command of the entire fleet went against every tradition and protocol. But Gendra remembered the reports from ships with human advisors, remembered the analysis Jake Morrison had presented, and remembered that traditional tactics had been failing consistently. "You have command, Colonel," she said. "What are your orders?" Danny Price immediately began issuing instructions that made every experienced officer in the fleet uncomfortable. All heavy cruisers pull back to defensive positions Delta through Omega. Light cruisers and frigates screen formation but maintain mobility. I want 3 fallback lines established at these coordinates. No ship is to engage beyond their assigned zone without explicit clearance. Scout ships maximum dispersion and maintain long-range observation protocols. General Krath's voice came over the command channel, rough with barely controlled anger. "You are ordering us to retreat before the battle even begins? This is madness. This is survival, General," Danny replied calmly. "The Devourers expect you to charge forward. We are not going to do what they expect. Now follow your orders or get out of the tactical chain." The Council fleet began moving into the positions Danny had specified, and every warrior species felt shame at what they perceived as cowardice. Instead of charging to meet the enemy, they were pulling back. Instead of aggressive attack formations, they were establishing defensive lines. It went against every instinct they had. Jake Morrison was back in his usual position, sitting at a rear station aboard the Valiant Dawn with his team. They were now officially integrated into the tactical network, with direct access to the fleet's sensor feeds and communication systems. As the Devourers approached, Jake was not watching the enemy ships themselves. He was watching how they moved, what formations they used, which vessels advanced first. "They are doing it again," Amy said quietly. "Same pattern as every previous engagement. The larger ships hang back while the smaller ones probe our defenses. Because we always bunch up to meet the probes, which lets the big ships hit us from optimal range once we commit," Kyle added. "It has worked every time, so they keep doing it." "Not this time," Jake replied. "Danny, recommend we ignore the probe ships entirely. Let them come all the way in while we focus sensors on the heavy vessels." Danny Price, in the main command center, relayed the order. The Council ships held their positions as the Devourer probe vessels advanced, weapons charging but not firing. The enemy ships came closer, then closer still, until they were practically on top of the Council fleet. Every warrior watching felt the urge to engage, to fire, to do something rather than sit passive. "Hold position," Danny ordered. "Let them think we are paralyzed with fear." The Devourer probe ships circled the Council fleet like predators examining wounded prey. Their sensors swept across every vessel, cataloging positions, weapon types, and shield configurations. Behind them, the heavy Devourer ships began moving forward, preparing to strike at what they assumed was a disorganized, frightened enemy. "Now," Danny said quietly. The Council fleet exploded into motion, but not the kind of motion the Devourers expected. Instead of charging forward to meet the heavy ships, the Council vessels scattered, moving along pre-planned retreat vectors that left the Devourer probe ships suddenly isolated in empty space. Before the enemy could react, designated Council ships opened fire on the probes from long range, overwhelming them with concentrated fire. Simultaneously, the rest of the Council fleet moved to fallback positions that formed overlapping fields of fire against the advancing heavy Devourer ships. The enemy found themselves charging into a defensive network rather than catching a panicked fleet. The battle became a grinding, frustrating affair for the Devourers. Every time they adapted to one tactic, the Council forces shifted to another. When the Devourers tried to push through the first defensive line, they found it was designed to fall back to a second line with prepared firing positions. When they tried to flank, they found scout ships waiting to warn of the maneuver. When they tried to concentrate their forces, the Council ships dispersed and attacked from multiple angles. The humans were not just commanding the battle. They were adapting it in real time, constantly analyzing the enemy's responses and adjusting tactics before the Devourers could exploit patterns. Jake and his team fed a constant stream of tactical updates to Danny, who translated them into orders that kept the Council fleet moving, changing, and surviving. For the first time in months of warfare, the Devourers were not winning easily. They were still dangerous and deadly, destroying Council ships with terrifying efficiency whenever they caught them. But they could not catch enough ships to break the defense. The Council forces were trading space for time, giving ground but making the Devourers pay for every meter. The battle raged for 6 hours, longer than any previous engagement. The Devourer fleet finally began to withdraw, not destroyed but frustrated and unable to achieve the quick victory they had expected. The Council fleet did not pursue, instead holding their defensive positions and conducting damage control. When the enemy finally vanished into faster-than-light travel, a ragged cheer went up from the surviving ships. They had not won decisively, but they had survived and driven off an enemy that had been crushing them in every previous battle. For many of the warriors, it was the first time they had faced the Devourers and lived to see the end of the engagement. In the main command center of the Valiant Dawn, Fleet Admiral Gendra looked at Colonel Danny Price with new respect. "You did what no one else could do. You made the Devourers retreat." "We did not make them retreat, Admiral," Danny replied. "We just made it too expensive for them to keep attacking. There is a difference." Over the next several days, as the Council fleet regrouped and repaired, a dramatic shift began to occur. Species that had mocked human caution now quietly asked for human advisors to be assigned to their ships. Tactics that had seemed cowardly began to be studied and practiced. The defensive depth, the fallback positions, the emphasis on survival over glory, all of it began to spread through the fleet. Commander Vekthar found the humans 20 minutes later in the rear emergency station, his armor scorched and his scales showing several fresh wounds. He stared at the 5 humans sitting calmly at their stations, surrounded by displays showing camera angles from throughout the battle. "That was you," he said, his voice rough. "The bulkheads, the gravity shifts, the targeting data. You did all of that from back here." Jake looked up and nodded. "Yes, Commander. Why? Why were you not at the front fighting beside us?" Vekthar's voice carried genuine confusion now rather than contempt. "Because someone needed to see the whole battlefield," Jake replied, gesturing at the displays. "You cannot do that from the front." The Krenth warrior opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He looked at the displays showing multiple angles of the battle, the tactical overlays, the environmental control logs. From their position in the rear, the humans had been able to see things that the fighters at the front never could. They had watched the battle develop, identified patterns, and responded with precision that would have been impossible from the chaos of the front lines. Vekthar turned and left without another word. The humans returned to their analysis. The GSC Valiant Dawn was severely damaged and had to retreat to a rally point where other Council ships were gathering. Of the 3 Devourer ships, 1 had been destroyed, but the other 2 had escaped, apparently learning from the encounter just as the Council forces had. The victory had cost the Council fleet dearly. 17 ships destroyed, thousands dead, and morale severely shaken. As the surviving ships regrouped over the next several days, reports began flowing in from other engagement sites. The pattern was always the same. The Council forces would engage the Devourers with traditional aggressive tactics. The initial moments would go well, and then the enemy would adapt and devastate the attacking fleet. The only exceptions were ships that had human advisors aboard. Those vessels consistently performed better, suffered fewer casualties, and maintained tactical coherence even during the worst moments of battle. Fleet Admiral Gendra called for a full strategic review, and this time when the Council gathered, there was none of the previous confidence and boasting. The representatives were shaken, confused, and desperate for answers. They had thrown their best warriors against the Devourers and barely survived. Colonel Danny Price stood in the back of the strategic chamber, the same position the humans had taken during the first Council session, but this time when he began speaking everyone listened. "The Devourers are not invincible," Danny began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "But they are different from any enemy you have ever fought. They adapt, they learn, and they punish aggression. Every species in this room has a proud warrior tradition built on courage, honor, and decisive action. The Devourers have learned to exploit those traditions, He gestured to the holographic display, which now showed detailed analysis of multiple engagements. Look at the pattern. In every battle, the Council forces charge forward to meet the enemy head-on. You fight with courage and skill, but you fight predictably. The Devourers watch how you respond. They adapt their tactics, and then they destroy you using your own patterns against you. General Krath growled low in his throat. Are you saying we should be cowards? That we should run from battle? No, Lisa Grant replied, stepping forward to stand beside Danny. We are saying you need to stop fighting their war and start fighting yours. Jake Morrison activated his tablet, and the holographic display changed to show the battle aboard the Valiant Dawn. The Council representatives watched in silence as the recording played, showing the humans in the rear emergency station, controlling the environment, redirecting defenses, and feeding targeting data to the frontline fighters. This is defensive depth, Jake explained. While you were fighting at the front, we were fighting from the back. Not because we were afraid, but because that is where we could be most effective. The Devourers expected you to all rush forward because that is what every species in the galaxy does. They did not expect anyone to be watching from behind, controlling the battlefield, setting traps. Amy Chen pulled up more data. We have been analyzing every engagement with the Devourers for the past month. They are incredibly dangerous in direct combat, but they have weaknesses. They rely on adapting to their opponent's tactics, which means they struggle when those tactics keep changing. They focus on the most obvious threats, which means they miss subtle ones, and they push forward aggressively once they sense victory, which makes them vulnerable to counterattacks. Brandon Lee added, The problem is not that you cannot defeat them. The problem is that you are all trying to defeat them the same way. You need to fight unpredictably, use tactics they have not seen before, and be willing to adapt faster than they can. The council chamber was silent for a long moment. Finally, High Priest Luminar of the Azurians spoke, his crystalline form pulsing with slow, thoughtful light. You are asking us to abandon our traditions, to fight without honor, to use deception and trickery, to value survival over glory. No, Danny replied firmly. We are asking you to value victory over pride. There is no honor in dying uselessly. There is no glory in losing a war because you were too stubborn to change tactics. The Devourers do not care about your traditions. They will kill you and everyone you are trying to protect regardless of how bravely you die. Fleet Admiral Gendra leaned forward, her forearms crossed in a gesture of deep consideration. You humans have been spacefaring for only 30 years. How can a young species possibly understand warfare better than civilizations that have fought for thousands of years? Jake Morrison smiled slightly, though there was no humor in the expression. Because, Admiral, we have been fighting for millions of years, long before we ever reached the stars. Humans were fighting for survival on a planet that was actively trying to kill us. We did not grow strong in a galaxy where might made right. We grew strong in a world where everything was stronger, faster, and more dangerous than us. He pulled up images from Earth's history, massive predators, deadly weather, hostile environments. Our ancestors survived by being smarter than the enemies we could not outfight. We learned to set traps, to use terrain, to strike from ambush, and to run away when running was the smart choice. Every human alive today is descended from people who survived by any means necessary, including means that other species would call dishonorable. Lisa continued, You call us cowards for sitting in the back, but we sit in the back because that is where we can see everything, where we have time to think, and where we have the best chance of survival. On Earth, the warriors who always charged to the front died without leaving descendants. The ones who survived were the ones who learned to fight smart instead of brave. The council representatives were uncomfortable with these ideas. They came from cultures where position and presence meant everything, where being seen at the front was a mark of courage and leadership. The human philosophy contradicted everything they believed about warfare and honor. Then the alarms began screaming. The Devourers had found the rally point. The journey to the contested rim took 8 days, and during that time Jake Morrison and his team maintained their pattern of observation and note-taking. They attended every briefing, every planning session, and every tactical review, always sitting in the back, always watching, always learning. The other species had stopped paying attention to them, dismissing the humans as irrelevant observers who would contribute little to the coming battle. On the 8th day, the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the contested rim, and within minutes, the sensors detected 3 Devourer ships positioned near a dead star system. The alien vessels were unlike anything in the Council's databases. massive and organic-looking with surfaces that seemed to shift and flow like living tissue. They did not respond to hails or warnings, simply holding position as if waiting for something. Admiral Gendra gave the order to engage, and the Council fleet moved forward in perfect formation. The Krenth heavy cruisers led the charge, their massive cannons already charging for the opening salvo. The Velcros frigates spread out in a supporting pattern, while the Azurian ships began broadcasting their telepathic interference. Behind them, dozens of other vessels from a dozen other species moved in coordinated attack vectors, all converging on the 3 Devourer ships. The opening minutes of the battle went exactly as planned. Krenth plasma cannons struck the lead Devourer ship, and while the damage was less than expected, it was still significant. Velcros missiles followed, hammering the alien vessel from multiple angles. The Azurians reported success in disrupting Devourer coordination. General Krath was already transmitting victory messages when everything changed. The Devourer ships flickered, their forms becoming translucent for just a moment. When they solidified again, they were different. Their hulls had adapted, developing reflective surfaces that bent energy weapons away from vital systems. Their formation had shifted, no longer sitting passive but now moving with sudden, terrifying speed. What happened next would be studied in tactical academies for generations. The Devourers did not just fight back. They demonstrated an understanding of Council tactics that suggested they had been watching and learning for far longer than anyone realized. They targeted the Krenth ships first, not with weapons but with some kind of dampening field that shut down their plasma cannons. While the Krenth vessels were still reeling, the Devourers launched boarding torpedoes, massive projectiles that punched through shields as if they were not there, and buried themselves deep in the hulls of the Council ships. Aboard the Valiant Dawn, alarms began screaming as one of the torpedoes slammed into the primary hull near the command center. The impact shook the entire ship, sending crew members sprawling and causing lights to flicker throughout the vessel. Through the hull sensors, the crew could see the torpedo beginning to cut through the reinforced doors like they were paper. General Krath immediately ordered his warriors to the breach point. All Krenth forces formed defensive positions at the command center entrance. We will meet them head-on and show them the meaning of Krenth courage. The massive warriors rushed forward, their heavy armor clanking and their weapons charging. The Azurians moved to support positions, preparing to launch mental attacks the moment the Devourers emerged. The Velcros distributed themselves along the corridor approaches, creating overlapping fields of fire. Every species responded exactly as their traditions and training dictated, moving toward the threat with weapons ready and courage high. The humans did the opposite. Jake Morrison looked at his team and gave a simple hand signal. They had drilled this scenario 100 times during the journey, using the ship's schematics that Lisa had quietly downloaded on their first day aboard. While everyone else rushed toward the breach, the 5 humans moved quickly to the rear emergency station, a small secondary control room that most of the crew had probably forgotten existed. Kyle, get the internal sensors online. Amy, I need access to environmental controls for sections 12 through 18. Brandon, give me a direct link to the weapons lockers on decks 9 and 10. Lisa, map me every bulkhead and pressure door within 300 meters of the breach. Jake spoke quickly and quietly, his hands already flying across the control panels. Within 90 seconds, the humans had taken control of a significant portion of the ship's internal systems, none of which were currently being monitored because everyone's attention was focused on the breach point. Through the cameras, Jake watched as the Devourer torpedo finished cutting through the final door. What emerged was nightmare fuel. The Devourers were not ships piloted by creatures. They were the creatures themselves, or at least no one could tell where ship ended and being began. Massive things that looked like they were made from twisted metal and diseased flesh, each one standing nearly 4 meters tall and moving with a fluidity that nothing so large should possess. They carried no visible weapons because they did not need them. Their bodies were the weapons, capable of extending bladed limbs or firing projectiles of organic matter that dissolved armor on contact. The Krenth warriors opened fire immediately, their personal weapons blazing with concentrated energy. The shots hit their targets but seemed to cause minimal damage. The Devourers absorbed the energy, their bodies rippling and adapting, and then they charged forward with horrifying speed. The battle at the breach point was brutal and one-sided. The Krenth were brave and strong, but the Devourers were something beyond normal understanding. They moved faster than creatures that size should move, hit harder than their forms suggested possible, and adapted to every tactic the Council forces employed. Azurian mental attacks seemed to cause them discomfort, but not confusion. Velcross coordination was useless when the enemy could predict their movements. In the rear emergency station, Jake Morrison watched the disaster unfolding and waited for the right moment. The Devourers were pushing forward, driving the Council forces back through the corridors toward secondary positions. In another minute, they would overrun the command center entirely. Now, Jake said quietly. Amy's fingers danced across her controls, and suddenly the entire section of the ship became a tactical nightmare for the attackers. Bulkhead doors slammed shut at precisely calculated intervals, separating the Devourers into smaller groups. Some found themselves in sections that suddenly vented atmosphere, not enough to kill them but enough to disorient. Others were caught in areas where gravity suddenly increased to 3 times normal, slowing their movements. Still others found themselves in corridors where the lights shut off completely, while emergency strobes fired in patterns designed to overwhelm their visual systems. The Devourers were deadly and adaptable, but they had never fought an enemy that controlled the environment itself. While they struggled to adjust, Jake gave his next order. Weapons free. Concentrated fire on isolated targets only. The humans had not moved from their rear position, but they had spent the last 2 minutes repositioning internal security systems and accessing weapons lockers. Now automated turrets emerged from hidden panels and began firing at Devourers who were isolated and disoriented. The targeting was surgical and precise, focusing fire on one enemy at a time rather than spreading damage across multiple targets. Meanwhile, Kyle had been feeding tactical data to the Council forces, highlighting which enemies were vulnerable and which routes were clear. The information came through the command network with no attribution, but suddenly the defending forces found themselves winning. Krenth warriors discovered which Devourers were weakened and concentrated their attacks. Velcross teams found clear approaches to advantageous positions. The Azurians identified which enemies were momentarily confused and struck with coordinated mental assaults. The tide turned in less than 5 minutes. The Devourers that had seemed unstoppable were systematically eliminated, picked apart by an enemy that refused to fight fair. When the last one fell, the Council forces found themselves victorious but shaken. They had won, but only barely, and everyone knew they should have been slaughtered. The massive warship cut through the darkness of space like a blade through water. The GSC Valiant Dawn was the pride of the Galactic Council fleet, stretching nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern and bristling with weapons from a dozen different civilizations. Inside its cavernous halls, representatives from every major species in the known galaxy gathered for the most important mission in recent memory. The Devourers had appeared 6 months ago, destroying entire star systems without warning or mercy, and now the Council had finally assembled a force strong enough to push back. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood at the docking port with his small team of human advisors, waiting for permission to board. He watched as the other species entered before them, each delegation more impressive than the last. The Krenth warriors stood nearly 3 meters tall, their scaled bodies rippling with muscle and their eyes burning with the fierce light of a predator race. The crystalline Azurians floated past, their bodies humming with telepathic energy that made the air shimmer around them. The 4-armed Velcros moved with perfect precision, each limb carrying a different weapon, as if to announce their readiness for battle at any moment. Beside Jake, Major Lisa Grant shifted her weight slightly and scanned the docking area with eyes that never stopped moving. Sergeant Kyle Davis stood behind them with Corporal Amy Chen and Specialist Brandon Lee, the 5 humans looking almost plain compared to the exotic aliens around them. They wore simple gray uniforms with minimal decoration, carried standard-issue equipment, and spoke quietly among themselves while the other species announced their presence with loud boasts and displays of strength. Finally, the docking officer, a nervous-looking Trellin with too many eyes, waved them forward. The humans entered the ship and followed their assigned guide through corridors wide enough to accommodate the largest species. Everywhere they went, Jake noticed the same thing. The Krenth pushed to the front of every group, demanding the best positions and the most prominent stations. The Azurians drifted into central locations where their telepathic networks could reach everyone. The Velcros positioned themselves at tactical choke points, ready to respond to any threat. Every species seemed determined to be seen, to be noticed, to claim the most important spaces. The humans did the opposite. When they entered the first briefing room, Jake immediately moved to the back row. Lisa took the seat beside him while the rest of their team filled in the remaining rear positions. The guide looked confused, gesturing toward the empty front row seats reserved for new council members, but Jake simply smiled and shook his head. They were fine where they were. The same pattern repeated in the command center, the tactical planning room, and the officers' mess. Wherever they went, the humans chose positions in the back, away from the center of attention, with clear views of exits and approaches. It did not take long for the other species to notice. Commander Vekthar of the Krenth, a massive warrior with scales the color of old bronze and eyes like burning coals, approached Jake during the third day aboard. His voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke, loud enough that every being in the command center could hear. "Human Commander, I have watched your species since you arrived, and I must ask a question that troubles me," Vekthar said. His tone balanced between curiosity and contempt. "Why do your people always choose the back positions? In Krenth culture, warriors fight for the honor of standing at the front where glory is won and enemies are faced first. To stand in the rear is to admit weakness or cowardice. Which is it for humans?" Jake looked up at the towering alien without any change in his calm expression. He had expected this conversation eventually. Every species in the galaxy seemed to have the same obsession with frontal positions, as if the front of a room or a formation somehow determined worth. "Old habit," Jake replied simply, offering nothing more. Vekthar's scales rippled with what might have been amusement or frustration. "Habit? You have been a spacefaring species for only 30 years. What habit could be so ingrained that it overrides basic tactical positioning?" "A very old habit, Commander," Lisa added from her seat, her eyes never leaving the tactical display she was studying. "One that has served humanity well for a very long time." The Krenth warrior snorted, a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve, and turned away. Jake could hear him muttering to his subordinates about the strange, timid humans who seemed afraid to stand where battles were decided. Around the room, other species exchanged looks and whispered comments. The humans had just confirmed what many suspected. They were a weak species, young and inexperienced, trying to hide their inadequacy by staying out of the way. Jake did not mind the assumptions. He exchanged a brief glance with Lisa, who raised one eyebrow slightly. They both knew the truth would reveal itself soon enough. It always did. The War Council convened that evening in the main strategic chamber, a circular room with a massive holographic display dominating the center. Representatives from every species gathered around it, and once again Jake noticed the familiar pattern. The Krenth stood at the very edge of the display, so close their breath fogged the holographic projections. The Azurians positioned themselves at key points around the circle, forming a telepathic network. The Velcros distributed themselves evenly, hands always near their weapons. Other species jockeyed for position, each trying to stand closer to the center than their rivals. The humans took seats in the back row of the observation gallery, elevated enough to see the entire room and the display clearly, but far from the center of activity. Jake pulled out a small tablet and began taking notes as the council leaders began their presentations. Fleet Admiral Gendra of the Velcros spoke first, her forearms gesturing at the holographic star map, where red markers indicated devourer attacks. "They strike without pattern, without warning, and without mercy," she said, her voice sharp and precise. 16 systems destroyed in 6 months. Billions dead. We must respond with overwhelming force. General Krath of the Krenth slammed one massive fist against his armored chest. "The devourers are strong, but we are stronger. Let us find their homeworld and burn it to ashes. The Krenth fleet will lead the charge, as we have led every great battle in Council history." High Priest Luminar of the Azurians pulsed with blue light. "Brute force alone will not suffice. We must combine our strengths. Azurian mental attacks can confuse their coordination, while Krenth warriors engage them directly. Together we are unstoppable." For hours the debate continued, each species boasting of their capabilities and proposing strategies that emphasized their particular strengths. The humans remained silent, but Jake's fingers never stopped moving across his tablet. He was not recording the grand speeches or the boastful claims. Instead, he was noting patterns in how each species thought about warfare, documenting their assumptions, cataloging their blind spots. Lisa leaned over and whispered quietly, her voice barely audible even to Jake sitting right beside her. Third time Admiral Gendra has mentioned overwhelming force. Fifth time General Krath has referenced direct charges. The Azurians keep talking about combined frontal assaults. Jake nodded slightly, adding her observations to his notes. They all think the same way. Hit hard, hit fast, hit first. Nobody is talking about what happens when that does not work. Colonel Danny Price, the senior human officer present, had been sitting silently for the entire council session. Now he leaned forward slightly and spoke just loud enough for his small team to hear. Notice what else nobody has mentioned? Amy Chen answered immediately, her eyes still scanning the room. Retreat protocols, fallback positions, defensive depth, alternative strategies if primary plans fail, supply line security, or any kind of long-term strategic planning beyond the initial engagement. Danny smiled slightly. Exactly. They are all planning to win the first battle. None of them are planning for a war.